Max Verstappen was sitting in a gravel trap at Stowe with 4 laps to go at the British Grand Prix. His race was over, his championship was bleeding out, and he had spent the entire weekend warning Red Bull that exactly this was going to happen. They didn't listen. What came out of his mouth on that radio and in front of the cameras was not just frustration, it was something far more serious. Because when you look at everything that happened at Silverstone this weekend, not just the crash, but everything before it, you start to realize that the most dominant partnership Formula One has seen in years is quietly falling apart. The problems started before a single racing lap had been completed. During qualifying, Verstappen could only manage 7th on the grid, nearly 0.8 of a second behind championship leader Kimi Antonelli. That gap was enormous. But the stopwatch wasn't what bothered him most. Throughout the session, his radio messages told the story of a driver who had completely lost faith in his machinery. The power unit wasn't delivering energy correctly. Acceleration felt inconsistent. Hybrid deployment was unpredictable. He called it abnormal. Then he called it a disaster. Those weren't emotional words. They were a genuine warning that something inside the car was wrong, and Red Bull either couldn't find it or weren't willing to acknowledge it. After qualifying, Verstappen went directly to Red Bull's senior management with a demand that surprised everyone in the paddock. He wanted to change the entire power unit. That decision would mean starting from the pit lane, throwing away 7th on the grid before the race had even begun. Most drivers avoid that penalty at almost any cost. Verstappen didn't care. Starting from the pit lane with a car he trusted was better than starting 7th in a car he had just called a disaster. Red Bull said no. Laurent Mekies and the engineering group reviewed the data and reached a completely different conclusion. The risk wasn't large enough to sacrifice a grid position. And so, for one of the very few times in recent memory, Red Bull openly overruled their 4-time world champion and sent him out in the exact car he had described as untrustworthy. When a journalist approached Verstappen on the grid Sunday morning, he simply shook his head and said, "Ask the team," because he would have done it differently. It wasn't anger, it was resignation. When the race started, things briefly looked like Red Bull might have been right. Verstappen launched brilliantly, gained positions immediately, and began fighting through the field. But inside the cockpit, nothing had changed. The downshift still felt wrong. Energy deployment was still inconsistent. Despite all of that, he somehow dragged the car into podium contention as chaos unfolded around him, Hamilton serving a penalty, Antonelli's race collapsing, the order reshuffling in Red Bull's favor. He admitted afterwards that even a podium finish wouldn't have felt deserved. On the hard tires, they were genuinely slow. He couldn't understand how he kept Russell and Hamilton behind for as long as he did. The race was exactly what he had predicted from the start. Then lap 47 arrived. Approaching Stowe at over 290 km per hour, the rear wing failed to return to its high downforce position as it switched out of straight-line mode. In an instant, the car lost all rear grip. Verstappen had no chance. The RB22 snapped sideways, spun across the runoff and buried itself in the gravel. Race over. The wing that failed had been nicknamed the Macarena wing by rivals in the paddock. Red Bull introduced it in Miami earlier this season. The concept involves the entire upper plane of the rear wing rotating roughly 180 degrees in straight-line mode, rather than simply adjusting its angle of attack. On paper, a performance advantage. In practice, it had become one of the most dangerous pieces of equipment on the 2026 grid, because this was not the first time. 1 week earlier, in Austria, the exact same scenario had played out: rear wing failing to reattach, car spinning at high speed, Verstappen walking away from something that could have been far worse. Mekies confirmed the Silverstone failure was technically different to Austria, but Verstappen made the point that actually matters: a different fault with the exact same outcome. While turning into the corner, the rear wing was not fully attaching and he lost all downforce and spun off the track. He said it was super dangerous. He could have really hurt himself twice in 2 weekends. He was lucky in Austria, he was lucky at Silverstone, and that is why he was completely fed up. Mekies stood in front of the cameras and accepted responsibility. He said Verstappen was right not to be happy. He promised a full review with all options on the table, including potentially abandoning the Macarena concept altogether and returning to their original design. But that apology landed against a backdrop that made everything feel much heavier than a technical setback. Because this wasn't happening inside a stable team operating normally. Christian Horner was removed from his leadership role last season and returned to Silverstone this weekend as a spectator for the first time since his departure. Verstappen was in the same paddock all weekend and never spoke to him once. Giampiero Lambiase, the race engineer who has been the voice in Verstappen's ear throughout his entire Red Bull career, has announced he is leaving the team. Chief engineer Paul Monaghan is also being linked with the departure. The people who built 4 consecutive world championships are walking out the door. And then there is the contract situation. Verstappen is signed at Red Bull until 2028, but buried inside that deal is a performance clause. If he is not running inside the top 2 of the championship by the summer break, he is allowed to leave. Right now, he sits 7th, 103 points behind Antonelli. That clause is no longer theoretical, it is active. The obvious destination would have been Mercedes, but Toto Wolff's team now has Antonelli leading the championship and Russell winning races. They don't need Verstappen. McLaren is locked up with Norris and Piastri. The door that looked open for so long has quietly closed. Verstappen has an exit clause, but nowhere obvious to go. He said afterwards he just wanted to go home and stop thinking about Formula One. That from a man who has dedicated every waking moment of his life to this sport. The British Grand Prix will not be remembered simply as another retirement in a difficult season. It will be remembered as the weekend the distance between Max Verstappen and Red Bull became impossible to ignore. The ignored warnings, the overruled demands, the dangerous wing failure, the engineers leaving, a 4-time world champion sitting in a gravel trap knowing he had seen every single moment of it coming. Do you think Verstappen will still be at Red Bull when the 2027 season begins? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you want breakdowns like this every week, make sure you are subscribed. See you next time.